Alright guys, Murph's here. And today we are going to discuss some Fuddisms. Now, this is actually a viewer requested video in which I've decided to kind of scale down what the original question was and go after a couple of particular Fudd myths or Fudd lore type things that I have seen advocated for either in my presence at a gun shop or a gun show or something like that, or I've interacted with through the channel. Now, of course, we're going to have to define some terms first off before we get too far into this, starting off with what is a Fudd? Well, a Fudd is a person in the firearms community who advocates for outdated technology, ideas, or techniques. And there's a couple of different classifications of Fudd, in my opinion. I kind of break it down in two ways. So you have your casual Fudd, who is somebody who is not necessarily a high round count shooter or trainer or anything like that. They shoot quite frequently, but a lot of their information is entirely secondhand. It's not something that they have sought out or attempted to learn more about as much as grandpa told them something. It's always worked for them. Grandpa seemed like a credible source, so they kind of just kept it going, or for their father, or perhaps they interacted with somebody who seemed to be an authority on the subject, military law enforcement, an instructor of some sort at a gun shop or a gun show, or now in internet forums. I think it's probably the next big breeding ground for Fudds. And they've never really sought to try to dispute any of the information that they've been given. They've just kind of just run with it because it seemed credible enough and it hasn't necessarily not worked for them. So that is the casual Fudd. Now you also have your entrenched Fudd, I guess I'll refer to this person as. So this is somebody who perhaps had some sort of role in the firearms community. They were law enforcement or military, something along those lines. Maybe they did a short stint in either of those jobs, or maybe they retired out of those jobs. Regardless, they have ingrained certain activities that were probably relevant in the time that they were doing that job. However, once they left that job, once they retired or they got out or whatever it is that they did, they stopped seeking out that information. They stopped conducting things. They stopped conducting current things. So as technology or techniques have changed and progressed in that career field, they have not kept up with it, so they are still advocating for outdated things because it worked once upon a time. That is a more difficult group to approach because they're not necessarily wrong as much as a lot of the context for where it is that they're right is not as in line as it could be. And we'll discuss that more at the end, once we get to the conclusions portion of this particular video. For now, I have identified 5 Fuddisms. Now, what is a Fuddism? Well, a Fuddism is just like a Fudd lore or Fudd myth, which is whatever these ideas that these people are advocating for. A lot of them are not necessarily based in science, or they are in major need of an update on ideological views and all that kind of stuff, application of techniques, whatever it is that it may be. Those are what Fuddisms are, and that is what we'll be addressing today. All right, so I picked out 5, and they're in really no particular order, but I do want to have them delineated. We will count down to 1, which is going to be my overall favorite. That way, if you guys are getting kind of bored in any particular subject, you can hop into the description where you'll be able to look at the chapter selection and decide what Fuddism you'd like to take a look at next. All right, so now let's get rolling. Number 5 is going to be racking a shotgun, sending your opponent running. Now, this is not to say that this is not true. Honestly, for the vast majority of home invasions and stuff like that, about any noise could send a criminal running. Be it the sound of somebody moving about in the dark, a dog barking, something getting knocked over, or the racking of a shotgun, the cycling of a slide, the movement of a bolt, whatever it is that it may be. Those are things where your average criminal is not looking to get into a shootout over your TV. They're definitely going to book it out of there. However, I have seen people take this piece of advice a step further. I remember when I was a kid, I had a friend of mine had multiple break-ins in his neighborhood, and the parents all got together in the neighborhood. They had a little meeting about trying to figure out what was the best way to remedy this issue. And that's pretty cool. You got communities coming together and all that kind of stuff. So the neighborhood had a meeting, and a law enforcement officer stood up during that meeting and stated that everyone needed to have a pump-action shotgun. So that way, even if it was unloaded, if anyone was uncomfortable with actually handling firearms or anything along those lines, all they had to do was just rack it, and that guy was going to book it. This idea is exceedingly problematic because what happens if someone calls your bluff as you stand there with an unloaded gun? Now, of course, this is one of those things where not everybody is capable of taking life, and that's okay. There are lots of other means to ensure your own safety aside from a firearm. A firearm, really, when we're talking about different defensive systems and all that kind of stuff, is kind of a last resort, especially since there's a lot of like legal and all kinds of ramifications that could potentially come about from shooting somebody in a self-defense type situation. You're not automatically the good guy. This is not the movies where just everyone accepts that you did everything right. There will be court proceedings and all that kind of stuff, and also potential civil liability to go along with it, which is kind of a whole separate discussion, but it is something that kind of guides this discussion, so we can't necessarily ignore it. Now, if you have somebody who is not comfortable with firearms, is not capable of withstanding the recoil of firearms, or is uncomfortable with the idea of taking a life, in any way advocating for them to use a firearm is pointless. You either need to scale the firearm to something that they can actually handle, or you need to seek alternate means of hardening their sight. Alarms, cameras, dogs, better locks, secure the windows, all that type of stuff. There's a lot of passive measures that you can utilize in order to be able to harden a structure so that that person doesn't have to entertain the possibility of defending their life violently and taking somebody else's. Could it still wind up going that direction? They are making that conscious trade-off. You cannot make that choice for them. However, telling them to have an unloaded firearm to defend themselves with is morally reprehensible, especially if somebody decides to call that bluff. Vast majority of criminals in this case probably going to take for the hills, unless this guy is a violent offender. Perhaps he's now taken that racking of a shotgun to be a challenge, and now you identified where you are. Or perhaps they are a rapist or something along those lines, and that was the whole point of them being in there to begin with. So now they're willing to take on and see if you're actually willing to throw down. At that point, you went from a method of deceiving them to having a club, and not a very good club at that. This is not positive. This is not going to end out well for you, especially if you're not comfortable with the operation of firearms or taking a life to begin with. You're not necessarily going to resort to using that thing as a club. Now we're running the possibility of that being used against you, and that is not a successful outcome. So this is a terrible bit of advice, and definitely one that could get you into a lot of trouble very quickly. All right, so going from there to number 4 would be the concept of progressive loads. And this specifically, we have to define some new terms here, because a lot of times you might hear somebody identify that you should load up your shotgun for home defense with rock salt or some other type of less than lethal option like rubber bullets or beanbag rounds or something along those lines. You see this advocated every once in a while. So, your first shell or two rubber bullets, and then you've got birdshot, buckshot, slugs all throughout your magazine tubes so that you can up your engagement as it goes longer, should that situation arise. Now, there's a couple things that we have to take into account with this. Now, let's define terms first. We have non-lethal options, and then we have less lethal options. Non-lethal options entirely are a part of avoid. These are things that in no way get you involved in any type of fighting and have no possibility of resulting in anyone dying. So that is in a out in the world self-defense type situation, that is avoiding certain locations at certain times. That's being aware of your surroundings and aware of anybody else who also seems to be checking out everyone around them, making sure that you avoid those people. You don't walk down dark alleys at certain times of night, whatever it is that it may be, making sure that you identify yourself as not an easy target. That is an example of non-lethal defense capabilities. Locks, dogs, alarms, cameras, all those types of things are examples of non-lethal passive means of keeping yourself safe. Less than lethal options could still result in lethal outcomes. So, utilizing a taser, we see it all the time. Somebody uses a taser on somebody else, turns out they have a heart condition, they die. That's supposed to be a less lethal option, but it doesn't mean that it won't necessarily result in getting someone hurt. A good exception to this rule would be pepper spray. Pretty low probability somebody's going to die from pepper spray, but it's not impossible. Now, whenever we talk about projectile type weapons, there is absolutely a possibility of somebody getting killed. People get killed with rubber bullets all the time. Beanbag rounds, same type of deal. Shooting someone in the face with rock salt at close range, probably not going to be very good for that person. I don't know if it'll kill them, but it'll definitely maim them, and they will be very, very unhappy. And again, we come back to criminal or civil suits following, depending on how the situation unfolds. I personally do not like the idea of introducing rules of engagement when I have none to begin with. So you're not law enforcement, you're not military, or you're not performing in those functions, you don't necessarily have rules of engagement. The rules of engagement are set up in order to be able to protect those groups who are responsible for doing those types of actions. You do not necessarily have that protection. It's not worthwhile to act like you do. In my own personal way of thinking, if I am bringing up a firearm to defend myself, all other measures of dissuading this conflict have passed. Once I get to the point of discharging that firearm, it is with lethal intent, because lethal intent is present. Somebody means to hurt me. I have identified this beyond a shadow of a doubt. We are fighting now. And these are decisions that I've already made in advance, which is a really big part of fighting mindset, is kind of deciding where it is that your line is at. You have to make that decision in a self-defense situation, and I do not think that progressive loading a weapon system is a good use of that, in my own opinion. You're incurring a lot of liability and a potentially flawed system for being able to separate friend from foe. And this could really go downhill in an awful lot of ways that you can't necessarily control. And I would encourage you that if you're going to utilize a firearm for self-defense, that it only be used for lethal means, and to not try to trifle with the idea of less than lethal means out of that same system. Especially if the situation unfolds in such a manner that we jump straight to lethal. That person opens fire on you before you get a chance to fire your rock salt and dissuade them from fighting with you further. You're now responding to lethal action with less than lethal means. That's not worthwhile. And that's also cutting into the amount of ammunition you're bringing into the fight, because all of your less than lethal options just became pointless. So that's something to think about there. So that is why I do not advocate for progressive loading, and that is a conversation that I actually saw a Facebook comment, a YouTube comment on a couple of years ago, where there was a gentleman who claimed that he carried rat shot as the first round in his semi-automatic handgun. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, rat shot is a small shot shell that can be loaded into any variety of cartridges. You see them built for 38s, 22s, 22 Magnums, 45 ACP, 9mm, and all that kind of stuff. And generally, they're chambered in revolvers or derringers. And I've tried to feed them through semi-automatic systems before. My dad bought a bunch when we were kids and we were playing around with it. They don't feed that effectively. The stuff is designed to kill rats or perhaps snakes or something along those lines, clear the barn out, or whatever it is that you might need to use it for. They are not designed to shoot people, at least not effectively. So this gentleman's plan was that if ever he had to use his gun in self-defense as he went about his day, that he would at least be able to shoot somebody with rat shot so that they could decide whether or not they wanted to continue this fight. Once again, we're using a firearm to dictate less lethal options of getting out of it. Avoid was an option. Not necessarily go straight to shooting somebody with a less than lethal mean. That's just not... doesn't work out. Not a fan. Would not recommend. All right, so that was number 4. Now let's go ahead and talk about number 3. And this is advocating for the .22 long rifle as a self-defense tool. Now, I actually recently did a video on .22 long rifle, and I'll put the link to that in the description. But what you generally hear whenever someone advocates for this in the defensive type means is because it'll go in your foot and bounce around your body and like come out your head. It just does all kinds of crazy stuff. The .22 is this crazy assassin's bullet. You know, you shoot somebody in the forehead with it and it'll go through their skull, but it'll bounce off the back of their skull and go back and forth and just scramble your brain and all that kind of stuff. It's this sleeper effective self-defense round. That's not taking quite a few things into account. First off, bullets in general will wind up doing weird things in the body, especially when we're talking about handgun rounds of relatively low velocity and low mass, or intermediate type rounds, which have a tendency to destabilize and target media to begin with, 5.56, 5.45, all that kind of stuff. In general, if you're doing blood sweeps on somebody, let's say that you have a victim with a gunshot wound somewhere in the chest, you identify where that wound is and you go to the back in order to be able to find the exit wound. The exit wound's not going to be right in line with where the entry wound was, necessarily. It could be, it could not be. It could wind up being that they got shot in the upper chest and the exit wound is in the lower back. That does happen from time to time because bullets do stuff. Bones are dense, bones are rounded, so if you give the opportunity for something moving at maybe a little bit lower velocity and with not enough mass to overcome the bone, they're going to wind up changing direction, possibly following that bone. There have been tons of times where someone's been shot in the arm or something like that, and the bone is ridden, or the bullet has ridden up the bone and exited out the elbow, or getting shot in the leg. Same type of deal with the knee. 22s are especially open to this because we're talking about really small, lightweight bullets moving fast, but not that fast. So they don't have enough energy to be able to just punch right through bone. They wind up changing direction, but they don't do it in some crazy ricochet manner like something out of a bad action movie. They might wind up going through organs that actually matter. The 22 might just wind up stopping against a bone. There's really no way to be able to predict that, and because of that, this does not make it a good recommendation as opposed to actual major cartridges. The 22 is really only a good recommendation if by either age, injury, or disability, you can't handle a more major cartridge. Otherwise, you should be shooting something in a larger diameter with more energy, more velocity, blah, 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 blah. So, that was number 3. Let's go ahead and talk about number 2, and this is hopping to the opposite end of the spectrum, where the 45 ACP, God's caliber, and unfortunately 10 millimeters also rolled into this. 10 millimeters, the new Premier Fudd cartridge. Now, I carry a 45 because they don't make a 46. It's got all this stopping power, 2 world wars, all that type of thing. That's what you hear a lot of Fudds talk about whenever it is that they say that they carry a 45, and there's a lot that goes into unpacking this. Now, for a personal interaction type aspect here, I remember a couple years ago I was in a gun shop and a fella had come in. He was wanting to help his wife pick out a self-defense handgun. Now, first off, his wife was staying in the back. She was standing behind him pretty much the entire time. She didn't have a lot of input, and I couldn't tell if this was a matter of she didn't actually have an interest in getting a self-defense handgun or if he was just being an overbearing husband. There was really no way to tell, and it's honestly not my business. However, he was looking at a lot of, the guy behind the counter was offering a lot of different 9mm and .380 caliber options, and at this point, he now chose this as the time to loudly pronounce to everyone in the gun shop that he prefers to carry a 45, talking about how he had a friend who was a medic who claimed that in Vietnam they'd shoot soldiers, the Viet Cong in the shoulder, and it'd bring them around and break their necks, which I'm no doctor, but I'm pretty sure that's not physically possible. It's kind of like the same people who claim that if like a 50 cal passes too close to you, it'll like rip your arm off. That's not a statement based in science. Now, the 45 discussion in this case, in my opinion, boils down to 3 concepts that I invoke whenever it is that I'm talking about pistol cartridges in general. First off, pistol cartridges are terrible fight stoppers. Absolutely horrendous. The only reason they are viable fight stoppers is because they are convenient to carry. Carrying a rifle all day is not convenient, which means you are less likely to do it. You can't take it into as many places. And even though a rifle round is a far better fight stopper, if it's not available to stop the fight that you're in, it doesn't matter. So that is why handguns are acceptable defensive options, but they are not good at it. This is an important dynamic. The next aspect of this is that when you take energy into account between 9mm, 40, and 45, they all hash out to being exceedingly comparable in actual energy output. Energy being derived from velocity and mass. So 124 grain 9mm moving at 1200 feet per second has very comparable energy to a 230 grain 45 ACP moving at 850 feet per second. So stopping power isn't really a conversation that we're having at this point. The next thing that we really have to get into here, this is kind of the third point that is what I always think of whenever we talk about the 45 ACP discussion, is that a large number of you have an uncomfortable amount of your ego invested into your cartridge. And it blows my mind. I see it all the time in my cartridge discussion videos. This, that, and the other thing. You have a lot of your personality invested into your handgun cartridge. And it confuses me, honestly. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about a couple of aspects with the 45 here. Now, when the 45 ACP was first introduced in 1911, It was an absolutely amazing military cartridge. And if you look at the longevity, only 9mm is really kept up with it in actual efficacy and all that kind of stuff. So that says a lot for both of these cartridges. Now, when you're also talking about a time when you're pretty much stuck with shooting FMJ, 45 ACP is an absolutely awesome option because you don't have the ability to be able to take a smaller bullet and make it larger. So being able to get that greater wound channel and destroy more tissue and all that kind of stuff is very important. That is an advantage of the 45 ACP in an FMJ. Taking that same idea and getting into the 70s, 80s, and 90s when hollow points start becoming more and more available and a lot more police officers are starting to use them. However, the technology has not really made hollow points effective. Going with greater mass is very important in this case. 10mm, 40 Smith & Wesson, 45 ACP all maintain the ability to be able to have a larger hole bored into them to be a hollow point. And then also, if for whatever reason the hollow point fails, it doesn't effectively expand or it gets choked up, whatever it is that occurs, if it just reverts to being an FMJ round, you at least have more surface area for destruction, tissue destruction, and your wound channel and all that kind of stuff. However, in the current state of things, we now have fantastic bullet technology to where we're getting 9mm up to higher velocities. We're getting it the 18 inches of penetration that the FBI wants to see, along with 1.5 times expansion. That's fantastic. That's great effect out of those cartridges. Now, you could also say that 45 ACP benefits from this technology, and you're absolutely correct. However, there's a lot more that goes into it because now we start taking into account that you might be facing multiple assailants. Having higher capacity becomes very important. Trying to have higher capacity in a 45 ACP becomes problematic. First off, the same with the 10mm, the grips become super fat, which makes it difficult for somebody with smaller hands to be able to handle, which means that it's not as available to a wider demographic. That's a problem all by itself. You can fit more 9mm and even 40 Smith & Wesson into the same size grip than you can 45 ACP. So that's kind of nullifying a lot of its advantages. Now, getting into the CCW side of things, some of those advantages start to fall away when you're talking about single stack guns, because 9mm single stack and 45 ACP single stack are pretty comparable. They're not one for one, but it's not as big of a detriment to the 45 ACP in a single stack type gun. However, it's still very large, which might make it more difficult to conceal, and it's still a lot of recoil in a small package. I've shot a wide variety of subcompact 45s, and for the most part, I don't really enjoy it. Same with the 40 Smith & Wesson. Now, the 40 is a little more snappy than a 45 is, which has a generally pleasant recoil profile to it until you shrink it. And then it still becomes a lot to handle, especially if you're talking about somebody who might have their adrenaline drop in a self-defense type situation and just completely brain dump everything, revert to lowest level train, to just start squeezing that trigger, sending rounds, just spewing lead all over the place. And in the worst case scenario, they might wind up killing somebody they did not intend to, turning this justified shoot into a homicide. Or they might just wind up missing their target completely and getting killed anyway, which is not effective. Whereas if they'd gone with a 9mm of similar size, they could have had better controllability and been able to place those hits with a still viable cartridge onto their target. Now, in addition to that, in the current trend of things, we have fantastic 9mm subcompact options with much higher magazine capacities. The SIG P365, the Springfield Armory Hellcat, the Glock 43X, all of these are very small, very slim pistols with double-digit capacity. That's pretty awesome. And when you consider that there's not that big of a ballistic difference between 9mm and 45, that really makes the 9mm the more viable option in this case. Now, of course, this comes down to individual taste and all that kind of stuff. If somebody really wants a 45, they need to take a couple of things into account. They might have to tailor how it is that they dress and all that kind of stuff accordingly, but their cartridge choice is still valid and still effective. But it is not the best in this case, because the best in this case is very subjective, and it comes down to the individual preference and basis. All right, so number one, this is actually my absolute favorite. I wound up doing an entire video dedicated to this because of some comments that I've had on other videos, and that is, you got too much crap on your gun. You'll run into this type of stuff a lot. What are you, Tactical Tim? What do you got all that crap on your rifle for? Grandpa fought in World War II with an M1 Garand, and he just had iron sights, and he got by just fine. All right, man, yeah, and you know, you go back a couple more generations, your great grandfather fought with a muzzleloader. And I mean, you know, you wound up existing because of that. So I guess that's a form of success. That does not mean just because it worked once upon a time that it is still valid and it's still a good option. And that's one of the key things of this discussion that we're having here. So I understand, I get where a lot of this comes from. So growing up, I kind of grew up in sort of a FUD situation. I grew up in Ohio where we hunted upland game, turkey, and deer. And in Ohio at the time, if you're going to hunt with modern gun, you had to hunt with a slug gun. Now they allow for straight wall cartridges. That was not the case when I was growing up. So shotguns. Shotguns were the major thing for us. We spent a lot of time on the trap line, and then, you know, we got our shotguns zeroed in and hunted deer and all that kind of stuff, and that was our go-to thing. If there was a defensive option that we were going to start off with, it was going to be a shotgun. Handguns were viable defensive options because of concealed carry and all that kind of stuff. So we had a lot of handguns. We shot a lot of handguns, and that was another defensive option that we would default to. Dad would generally carry a Ruger Security 6 or perhaps his Springfield Armory 1911 and occasionally a Glock 17, depending on how he was feeling that day. Rifles, on the other hand, were just giggle factor. We couldn't hunt with them, so they weren't serious use for us, and we didn't have a lot of tactical options in my family when I was growing up. The closest we got was the Ruger PC9 and PC40 carbines, and Dad eventually got rid of those. The longest term option we had was a Ruger Mini 14, which was a ranch rifle setup with a wood stock, no optics, no lights, none of that type of stuff. And then for a little bit we had an AK, but Dad eventually got rid of that as well because he didn't enjoy shooting it, which in hindsight, man, I miss that thing because I don't even want to begin to think of what he paid for that in the early 2000s. It would probably make me cry if I actually knew how much he paid, considering the cost of AKs right now. Now, we did shoot a lot of surplus rifles and Marlin 3030s and all that kind of stuff, but that was just giggle factor. And when it came to optics, I had 3-9s or 2-7s or something like that on the shotguns, and any of the hunting type rifles that we had lying around that we shot just for giggles. And we had like 4 power scopes on our muzzle loaders, but otherwise everything was iron sights. And that really formed a lot of my early opinion when it came to tactical type things. So much so, like my first interaction with AR-15s wasn't until I was an adult. And once I started using them for duty type application, I had an aim point, I think Comp M2. I think that was my first duty optic. Might have been a Comp M4. Doesn't really matter. But I kept my rear sight up, a Motec flip-up rear sight up, because I was more comfortable with my iron sights than I was with the red dot. Now, of course, that eventually changed. Now, I'm incredibly comfortable with red dots. They are actually a go-to optic for me. I have a ton of red dots on different rifles because I feel that I can do a lot with the red dot. At the time, I did not have that confidence. Growing up in that time, right, and going through the 70s, 80s, 90s, into the early 2000s, if you had a bunch of guns, and especially if you had a bunch of tactical-looking guns, you were a gun nut. You were some sort of revolutionary who was gonna take on the government and do all this crazy stuff and talking to God on the two-way radio and all that kind of thing. We've gotten kind of away from that perception. We don't automatically assume that anybody with a bunch of guns in the firearms community is crazy. Outside of the firearms community, absolutely. Everyone's convinced that we're a bunch of militiamen and we're gonna end the world and all that kind of stuff. I don't really care about their opinions. I care about the opinions within the gun community. We've changed our perception of ourselves. And a lot of that has to do with stuff on YouTube. Like, I remember discovering Military Arms Channel when I was much, much younger. And going, oh, that is really cool. I did have an interest in that gun. And look at how cool it is. Look how, tactical and all that kind of stuff. And then you got channels like Iraq Vet and going on into Garand Thumb and all that kind of stuff have really shown that these things in video, from video games that you see in movies and all that kind of stuff are accessible and acceptable for the average person to have. This is progress. This belief that because Grandpa fought in World War II with an M1 Garand, so all you need are iron sights, you don't need lights, lasers, and all those accessories, is ridiculous. It does not help the community grow. It only holds the community back. Now, you got tons of YouTubers like myself who are putting out videos on how best to set up a rifle, how to prioritize or optimize, and all these types of things. And it even extends to handguns, to where you keep running into people who claim that there's no need to have an optic on a handgun, when in all reality, if you actually work with it and learn how to shoot a handgun optic, it's actually quite nice. And for myself, whenever a new trend comes out, I observe it for quite some time. I research it. I stay on top of it. I sample it a couple of times. And at this point, I am now actively looking for options to be able to expand into that dynamic, specifically in this case being pistol optics. But I've done it with many other things before. Advancement's not wrong. Updating things is not wrong. And being a tactical Tim in this case is not wrong. All right, guys, so let's go ahead and start kind of wrapping this up. So one of the key things, right, is that there are lots of sources for bad information in the Second Amendment community. It does not just come from FUDs. And there are also plenty of new age FUDs, because let's face it, a lot of times FUDs are older people, older gentlemen who've been doing this for a little while and are kind of ingrained in their ways. You kind of expect that. Sometimes you have young FUDs, guys who have either revisited old ideals or are part of that group that just has that hand-me-down, passed down information and just never thought to do anything else with it. You've also got a ton of people who just have bad opinions. And the only person who can really determine whether or not that's the case is you. You have to appraise each person, each technique or procedure that they are recommending, and run through your own litmus test of whether or not that works or applies for you. Do research and study and all that kind of stuff. And I'm including myself in this aspect as well. There are plenty of people who think that I'm an idiot, and that's fine. I don't really care. I know what works for me, and I know what I recommend for other people, because that is a huge part of my job. Now, one of the big things that is fixable in this FUD mindset type thing is staying on top of emerging trends and evaluating them critically. You can use your background knowledge to be able to evaluate emerging trends and decide whether or not they are for you, because sometimes trends surge forward and sometimes they fall back. It happens. So for me, in my day job, I am no longer necessarily an operational element. I'm now riding a desk. I'm in a more supervisory position. However, I've got 14 years of experience in my field. So as long as I stay on top of new techniques, new trends, if I learn from my subordinates as they learn new things, attend new trainings and all that kind of stuff, and make sure that I am keeping a finger on the pulse of my community, I can use my background information, my knowledge, my experience to be able to help direct future development. And that's the way that we have to look at that. Just because you do 20 years in, let's say, I don't know, the Marine Corps and get out, does not mean that all progress stopped once you retired. There are still ways to be able to stay in touch with the community and evaluate new trends, new opportunities, new options, and then be able to, if you're in an instructor type position, you did 20 years in the Marine Corps, got out, decided you want to start teaching rifle courses and stuff like that, you owe it to your students to be up to date, to be on top of things, and give them the benefit of your knowledge, your experience in the face of these new trends. Not to just be stuck in your crusty old ways because, well, that's how we did it back then. That is the death of innovation. We have to push the boundaries, push the limits on what the next options are, and then decide whether or not they have gone too far or whether or not we're going down a rabbit hole that is not actually helpful. All right, guys, I would actually really like to hear down below in the comments section what your favorite Fuddisms are. In fact, if you really enjoyed this content and you want to discuss this with a whole bunch of other people, you should check out the Merch Law Facebook page, which the link will be in the description. There, we can throw up your favorite Fuddisms, maybe throw some memes on there or something like that, and discuss and laugh to our heart's content. All right, guys, that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.